Hello, Endersword here again, this time with a video on Apex Barrier, ISO Damage, ISO Defense, and Crit, and really trying to dig into these numbers and what's actually going to make a difference for you. I feel that in this game, there's been so much power creep that some of these numbers lack a lot of context, and people don't really understand what's an extra 5,000 Apex or an extra 120% Isolytic Defense or 30% Isolytic Damage actually going to get you, and how is it going to result in changes to your game and changes in your PvP fighting ability, which is, what I care about most. So I'm going to look at basically what the layout is for these, how they impact each other as you go forward, and then we're going to look at a example of a fight, analyze what these stats are in that fight, and then look at what happens if we start making changes to those numbers in what the overall result of that fight is. And I think that's something that's often not intuitive in the game. You end up with numbers that are like, okay, my Apex is at 35,000. If I add another 12,000, what does that really do to me in the game? And they try and give you kind of an idea of it. For each amount, it's going to save you this percentage, but what's the real result of that? Where's the sweet spots? When should I choose one over the other? When should I look at my Isolytic Defense instead of my Apex? When should I trade off defense for damage? Things like that that we want to be looking at. So first, we're going to look at what the basic distribution is. And for Apex Barrier and ISO Defense, it is a diminishing return. So the graph for Apex Barrier is this, which is basically something that ramps off over time as you increase what your Apex Barrier is. The key one to really know is at 10,000 Apex Barrier, we're mitigating exactly 50% of the incoming damage. For each 10,000 we go up, that decreases as we go. So here, 1/2 of the damage is getting through. At 20,000, 1/3 of the damage is getting through. At 30,000, 1/4 of the damage is getting through. At 40,000, 1/5, 1/6, 1/7, etc. Onwards. And you can see that basically once you get around that 40,000 plus, it really starts to taper off. Obviously, your really early numbers are the most impactful. And when Apex first came out and there was very little of it out there, then you had small researchers that are adding, in some cases, literally less than 100 each time, maybe a couple thousand that you could get from an artifact or this or that. And something like a tier 1 Mirror Picard was adding 10,000, which was gigantic. It was just cutting damage in half. And once you tiered him up, it was like 17, 22,000, and that was gigantic. Now it's not uncommon for somebody with no Apex officers at all to be in the 20 plus range to begin with. There's enough artifacts, forbidden tech, research, things like that out there, that's getting to be a bigger and bigger innate number, particularly in PvP. So you're already starting at the point where then adding somebody like Emperor Picard, adding that extra 10,000 is, well, what's the trade-off to this? What am I giving up for going with this crew? And then how is that going to impact, and what do I actually gain from it? So if I'm already at 40,000, do I really need to get to 50, or should I focus on something else? So we'll answer that hopefully a little later. We'll look at ISO Defense first. This is fundamentally the exact same curve with literally 2 zeros knocked off of it. So instead of 10,000 being the point that we mitigate 50%, 100 is the point that we mitigate 50%. At 200, we are mitigating 66.6%, and so on. So it's literally the exact same thing, 300, 75%, and so on. And it's also going to taper off once we get into the 90s. It's going to be very hard to push into the even low to mid 90s. But because this has been around a lot longer, it's pretty common now for most people to have well into the 80% to the low 90s range, simply because there's a lot of ISO defense that's out there in existence. There's a lot of ISO officers that people have had time to get, whether they're free to play or not. And there's a lot of artifacts, research, everything that is helping this out. But fundamentally, these are the same curve. They just do a different thing. ISO defense obviously applies only to the isolytic damage, whereas the apex barrier is going to apply to everything. So if one was even with the other, then the apex barrier is the more important one. But given that so much of the damage is ISO focused, they're fairly close together in initial impact. If you were going to take them from 0 to a number, Apex is a little better. But if you already had Apex at a certain rate, your ISO is behind, then you'd want to drag that up. So what we're going to do is look at a specific fight that we had in arenas this past Monday. So I tried to find a fight that was relatively even to start off with. So we're relatively even levels. I'm a tiny bit higher. Our ship is identical, so we've got the same tier to it. And I've got no additional components on this. I'm not sure about the opponent. We're using the same crew. Everything, so even the same little spider emoji, I think that makes a huge difference on the ship. But you can see that the actual result of this is really lopsided. So what is it that actually leads to this lopsided result here in the stats that we're going to look at? So if we then go into the battle log, we're going to want to compare what these numbers actually are and how that impacts the outcome of the fight. So in this case, we're going to look at isolytic mitigation compared to isolytic damage. So the way that you would calculate what this number is, because you of course don't know innately what your own number is or your opponent's, what it says on the ship, that's not your number. That's your number before there's any modifiers. So you may have an artifact that works against Romulans or against interceptors, or only in a PvP situation, or this officer only triggers when there's hull breach or whatever. None of that is listed on the ship stats. So you kind of have to get in the fight and then backwards calculate what your number is. So in this case, we're going to take the isolytic mitigation that I have and divide it by the isolytic damage that the opponent did to me. So in this case, we're going to take this 2.47 billion number and we're going to divide it by the 2.738 billion number that he actually fired at me. And we're going to come out with 90.2%. This is going to equate to a isolytic defense number somewhere in the mid 900s. Is going to get me that 90%. So I think 900 exactly would be literally 1 in 10. So that's exactly 90. So this is just slightly above the 900 in terms of my actual isolytic number. So if I wanted to add something to that, I kind of know what my starting point is. But 90.2 is the amount that we're mitigating. Then we're going to look at our standard mitigation. In this case, we're going to take the amount of standard damage that I mitigated, 254 million, divided by the 426 million that he shot at me. And in this case, I am mitigating 59.6% of this. In a standard PvP fight where you're in somewhat reasonable level range with your opponent, same ship, whatever, you can expect this to usually be somewhere in the 50s if you're same ship type. If they've got ship advantage over you, it may be more in the 30s, 40s. If you've got ship advantage, it may be a little higher. The maximum that this one can be, though, is 71.2%. So the isolytic mitigation and Apex technically have no cap to them, but the standard mitigation does have a cap of 71.2. And frankly, if you're at the 71.2, you were going to kill that person regardless, because you're probably out-leveling them, out-ship classing them by such a degree that it didn't matter anymore. But you're usually going to get a number around here. So with 59, I'm pretty happy with that. The Apex, tiny bit harder to calculate, but not that much harder. So what we're going to do is take the Apex number, so this 94 million, we're going to divide it by, and then in brackets, so altogether, the sum of Apex again, the shield damage that we took, and the hull damage that we took. So the idea is to say, out of the total damage that got through our first mitigation round, what percentage of that was caught by the Apex? So in this case, we're at 76.5%. This equates to about 32 to 33,000 Apex barrier on my side. Then we want to see what are his numbers offensively for isolytic and crit. So the isolytic damage, this one's really easy. You're just going to take the isolytic number and divide it by the standard number. And that's going to give you what multiplier they have for isolytic damage. Isolytic damage that you see is actually made of two parts. So it's made of the innate isolytic damage they have on their ship, research, artifacts, things like that, multiplied by the isolytic cascade that they have. So that then comes from officers, sources like that. So basically you've got a component that's going to be isolytic damage, isolytic cascade. Those react multiplicatively with one another and spits out this final number. Again, this is not going to match the number that it says on the ship because everything's conditional and it works in this case and not this case and whatever. So you can just retroactively tell what this is going to be. The last one is slightly more tricky in that it's hard to calculate exactly. So we're going to get a approximate number here. The best way to calculate crit damage is to find a case where you or your opponent has hit the same weapon, so shots from the same weapon on the same ship, that one critted and one didn't. And sometimes that's hard to find, especially if someone's at like 100% crit. But in this case, we've got an example of it. And the reason this is approximate is because the damage that a weapon does can vary. There's a minimum damage and a maximum damage that it can do, and it is randomly in that range. So you can only really approximate it. If you have multiple shots from the same gun, like 3 shots that did not crit and 1 that did, you can take the average of the 3 that didn't and compare it to the 1 that did, but there's always some wiggle room here. So in this case, just kind of take it at face value, 426.8, divide it by the 119 million, and we're going to get about 357%. And again, it could be plus or minus 10% of this, whatever, but that's enough to give us at least a decent estimate. If you've got a full battle log, you can get better estimates by comparing it multiple times and see if you're in the right ballpark, take the average at whatever. But here's the basic stats that we had going into this. My defensive stats, his offensive stats. We then flip it and do it to me. So in this case, we're now going to compare his isolytic mitigation. So in this case, he mitigated just over 6 billion isolytic damage when the shot was 6.7 billion. His isolytic damage is actually slightly higher than mine at 90.4%. So not a huge difference there, but that 2.2% could be an extra 50 isolytic defense that he has over me, but not a huge impact there. The standard damage actually almost exactly the same. We're at 59.6. Have to go to more decimal places to see the difference there, but we're both in the same ballpark. That shouldn't be surprising, again, given that we're very similar level. We're exact same ship, exact same tier, everything like that. So not a shock there. The apex, once again, we're taking the apex number and we are dividing it by the sum of the apex number, the shield number, and the hull number. And in this case, we do see a bit of a difference. He's now at 70.2% compared to my 76+%. The difference in this, while it only looks like 6% on paper, and it is, that's the actual mitigation difference, is 6%. The apex barrier difference as a raw number is this number equates to about 23,000, whereas the 76% equates to about 32,000. So it's almost a 10,000 difference between one and the other. So that could make a pretty big impact, even though the actual percentage of it looks fairly similar. You almost need to start thinking of it in the reverse of, while this is only a 6% difference in terms of the actual number, if you kind of flip it and say, I let through under 24% damage and he's letting through 30% damage, then he's letting through 25% more damage than I am. So even though it's only 6% in the actual mitigation number, compared to the damage taking, he's taking a lot more damage. Like 25% more damage to your hull is pretty significant, even though the baseline number looks quite similar. So keep that in mind. Then we take the isolytic damage that I have. This again is very, very similar to what he had. He was at 640 something. I'm at 637. You're just taking this number, dividing by that number to get that. The crit damage here, I don't have one showing that is non-crit, but you can both kind of see by the amount that I'm doing here, over 1 billion compared to his crit being 400 and something. And further down in the battle log, there's other examples. But I'm doing about 940% crit damage. That's compared to his 350 something percent. So there's quite a discrepancy in terms of the crit damage output that I'm doing compared to what he's doing. So that's going to play a factor when we look at what the actual result here is. And that's quite a big difference. It's almost 2.5 times as much as he's doing. So now we want to take a look at, if I'm going to try and take some of the X factors out of this. So since we're using the same ship, same crew, similar levels, and really the research isn't that difference between these two levels, things like that, let's assume that our ships have the exact same hull and do the exact same base damage. So let's assume that we both have hulls that are 10 billion and our shots are on average 1 billion just by base out of the gate. Just assume same things, but then we're going to use these 5 stats to calculate out what would that fight result look like. And in this case, we're getting me surviving 58 shots. So it would take 58 shots at 1 billion each to kill a 10 billion ship that I've got. In his side, it would only take 24 shots to kill that ship. That seems, again, somewhat in the right ballpark, and it's about 2.5 times longer that I'm living compared to him. The fight looks really, really one-sided. If you just looked at the battle log and I'm losing a sliver like that, he's losing almost all his shield and all his hull, you would think, well, obviously this is like you're 10 times stronger or something. You're not really. You're maybe a little bit stronger in these edge areas, but that accumulates to the point that the end result on what he was able to get to my hull, because the shield is absorbing so much, and what got to his hull is massively different. That it really doesn't compensate. It doesn't play out that way. Someone can be 10, 20% stronger, but the result is that they absolutely dominate you because the shield provides such a buffer. Just the way that things ramp up provides a buffer that the slightly stronger player tends to come out of a fight completely dominant. It's not in very many cases do you end up with like one person dead and the other person has lost 60% of their hull. That's pretty unusual in most of your PvP fights. You may have noticed it tends to be one person almost completely stomping the other one, even though they looked fairly similar going in. So this is basically what our kind of simulation would work out to, that he's surviving 24, I'm surviving 58. Now, what adjustments can we make to this that is going to help close this gap? So one that we pointed out in this was that his apex barrier was only 6% lower than mine, but that is about a 10,000 apex barrier difference. There is an officer out there that he could be adding that he didn't have that would provide that additional 10,000. So Rami is one of the newer officers from a few months ago that it would add 10,000 below deck, I think at tier 2 or 3, something like that. I think she starts at 7,000, ramps up depending on tier. She was available in an event store a couple months ago, so it is someone that you could get access to at least at the lower tier, completely free to play if you so desire. But let's add her to the below deck and say, what would the effect of the fight be if we added that 10,000 apex barrier? And here with the 10,000 added, suddenly that 6% has taken us from surviving 24 shots to 33 shots. So the 6% has allowed me to live like 33% longer. So I've added 9 shots on top of the 24. So quite a bit of survivability there. It seems small, but we're still in that sweet spot where you're in that 20, 30, 40,000 range where adding an incremental 10,000 really, really gets you a lot. If you're already at like 90,000, then adding an extra 10 probably wouldn't buy you as much and wouldn't make up the gap as much. But here, closing that extra 6% mitigation, ultimately resulting in more than a 30% survivability rate during this fight. But we still haven't done anything to impact how long I'm surviving here. So maybe there's something we can poke at. Let's say we have another below deck spot, or there's an artifact that we might want to go after, or a new strand of hair that is available in the artifact store for the DTI, whatever. So additional stuff we're working towards. Can we add on something that's going to increase our isolytic damage? One quick way that we could do it, and is the example I'm going to use, is let's finish off Gwen DeMarco. So that's something that probably a lot of free-to-play players are on the verge of getting if you've not gotten her already. If you've kind of been doing the invasion fleet stuff and kind of doing some of the events that are giving you a shard here and there, doing some of the SMSs, whatever, you're probably in the ballpark at least of a tier 1 of her. And if you've put any event store stuff or whatever into it, you may be a little further along. But there's other things similar. The Glaven out there can add about 60%. The strand of hair adds something. There's a lot of ways to get extra isolytic damage in the game if you're able to progress towards that. So let's assume that we're adding a Gwen DeMarco giving us 40% extra isolytic damage below deck. That 40% actually becomes multiplicative with the rest of the isolytic damage that I have. So if we assume that this player, based on the rest of his damage there, was at 600 and something, adding Gwen DeMarco is actually going to take us very close to 800% once you end up multiplying that by your base isolytic damage. So if we add her onto this, you can see that now we're taking my survivability down from 58 rounds to 50 rounds. So we've added a fair bit of isolytic. We're moving up close. I simulated about 780% isolytic damage after adding her, and that's going to shorten my survivability by 8 rounds. There's still a bit of a gap here, but we've definitely closed in on it. Now let's tackle what the biggest problem we had was, which is that I'm absolutely blowing him out of the water with crits, and his are very suppressed. What is another thing that you can go after, which is now at least semi-available free to play? You can work towards the Q cannon under the Chaos Tech tree. A lot of people I've seen have gotten lucky pulls of this. So people that weren't fortunate enough or didn't buy it up front, there are definitely chances to complete this and still pursue it. The Q cannon, what it does is lowers the crit damage that your opponent is doing by a certain percentage. Once you've got it maxed out, it's 300% less. It also is going to decrease the base damage that your opponent is doing per shot, which is somewhat negligible, but it does add up a little bit. So if we were going to throw the Q cannon onto this, now instead of doing 900 and something percent crit damage, I'm down to doing 600%. We're going to keep the extra isolytic from Gwen, the extra apex from Rami, and throw this all together and get to the result that now I'm dying in 50 rounds, but suddenly this person is surviving for 57 shots and would actually win this fight. So we made 3 adjustments, which I agree are not small ones, but they are basically loading on 2 officers and adding a chaos tech to the ship. We haven't tiered the ship up. These are things that are at least attainable free to play, maybe not right now, but something that you'll probably, if you want to work towards it, you could have those 3 things probably within a month or 2, depending how lucky you get with some of the Q cannon pulls, things like that. So they're not unattainable. And there's other ways to get similar stats. So other things that can lower the crit damage that often people neglect. The Q building, you always want to keep it up to what your current level is. That requires you doing Q trials and getting the building upgraded. That not only increases your own critical damage, but lowers that of your opponent. One thing that a lot of people still ignore today because it takes such a long time and is a grind is the Bajoran tree. So the Bajoran favors, pretty old content, but getting your Bajoran rep up to the max level can take like 9 months or something, and of just doing it daily. You need to be doing that because at the top levels of that in PvP is some pretty big favors that lower the crit damage of your opponent, increase the crit damage of yourself, lower the crit chance of your opponent, and increase the crit chance of yourself. Those are gigantic in a fight, so you don't want to leave them out. And then there's some of that on new buildings too. The District 76 building also affects crit damage, things like that. The Premium Dust Tree, the Omega Dust Tree, has things in there that affect crit damage as well. So don't want to be neglecting those. You can see how big that difference is if one person's crits are way bigger than the others. It's literally like I'm just doing 3 times the damage right out of the gate, and it's very hard to overcome that. So you can use some of these things to mitigate that back down. So the purpose of this, because you're not going to have all these options just available to you, but the idea is then what do you want to prioritize? So you want to kind of look at, get some standard battle logs that you have against an opponent of somewhat comparable strength, someone around your level, same type of ship, things like that. And then look at, well, what is my apex in this scenario? What are my defenses? What are my isolytic damage? Am I in the ballpark of these other people around my level? And then when I'm looking at what my crew is and what my below deck is, what am I most going to benefit from? So if I'm looking at my below deck and say I've got 5 slots down there, what do I want to pull out or put in? So one staple that's been down there a long time is Kira. She lowers the crit chance of your opponent. We're now at the point where unless somebody is running a crit crew, so either Honor Guard Worf or the Cardassians, the battleship crews and the morale crews aren't really going to crit anyway. So you don't even need her for that anymore. And then if you're running against the interceptor strike team like we were here, Garrick is going to overpower Kira really fast anyway. So it's almost a worthless spot to spend on her. You may be better off pulling her out and putting in an isolytic defense officer or an apex officer or an increasing isolytic damage officer. And the real key to it is trying to balance all of those. Another one that used to be a mainstay below and would be there with this crew when you're running Ducat, Garrick, and Billups, you would always put Jack Ransom below because he gives you isolytic defense whenever your opponent has hull breach. But the isolytic defense that he's getting at like tier 3 is only 50%. And the 50% is only, given that I'm already at 90% mitigation, is only going to take me from like 90.2 to 90.4 to match my opponent. But that 0.2 isn't going to do a lot for me. So, you know, we saw that 6% on the apex side had a pretty big impact, but 0.2% on the isolytic, it's nice to have. I wouldn't throw it away, but if I have to use an officer spot to get it, it's probably not worth it. So I'd rather take Jack Ransom off there, maybe leave a bigger one like Dr. Tana doing 100, 120%, and then put in somebody else that's doing more damage. An isolytic officer or an apex barrier officer or somebody else that is helping me in other ways for that fight. So it's really that, trying to balance out what you need. So you want to know what your stats are, which ones are good. So anything that's kind of in that high 80s, high 90, or like high 80s, low 90s mitigation, you're probably pretty good on that stat. And if something else is in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that's one that by throwing something extra on can really, really help you out. Also, that isolytic damage side, the lower you are, the more you want to add to it. And again, it's one of the few things in the game, perhaps the only thing in the game, that literally gets multiplicatively better. As you increase the isolytic base damage you have and the isolytic cascade, they multiply against each other. So you will always benefit from getting them. Also, a lot of the things that help you out on the isolytic damage side help you out in PvE. Most of those apply. So there's some of them that are only PvP, but a lot of the artifacts and things like that that you can get to help apply to both parts of the game. So suddenly you're doing more damage in your daily grinding there as well. So that's something you want to focus on. And then crit damage and so on. Like I pointed out, there's many sources to that. look through to see which ones you have, which ones you don't have, which ones you can improve on, because that really, really makes a difference. And the way they're structured is it's often a spread between you and your opponent. So upgrading a building not only increases yours, but decreases theirs. And if you let them get too much of an advantage on you, not only do they have a plus 50, but they hit you with a negative 80. So if you're kind of falling behind there, you're suddenly got a 130 spread instead of just that difference. So it can really make a big impact. And the other thing to consider, if you're looking at your crit damage numbers and see that they're really, really low at like 1 or 200% when you're critting, or even potentially literally below 100, there is crit floor research out there as well. Some of it is paid only at the moment, but some of it you can grind. So the Omega Dust and the X-Borg faction can give you at least 150% that you can get for free to put a floor on what your critical damage is. So if you find that you're dropping below that, then that's an option that you want to be considering as well. So I'm hoping that this gives some perspective on how to really track your fights and know what you want to improve. Because I think when you start off with a fight that looks really, really one-sided, like you start off with a fight like this, and you may think like, that's really daunting. Like this person just destroyed me. But you look at what's actually behind this, and this is very easily fixable. We made 3 adjustments that, you know, you can make within a couple months to move you in that right direction, and suddenly we get a fight that is going the other direction. So I think that sort of thing often puts people off, that they get into these arenas or any PvP situation and you just get destroyed by somebody that has slightly more stuff, and it seems like it's insurmountable, but it's not really. You can do things that will close the gap. And to be honest here too, I'm a pretty tough opponent, so you probably don't even need to make this many adjustments to it. Like, I've heavily focused on this sort of thing, but someone that's kind of around your level, around your area, and it feels like you're losing a fight really bad, trust me, you're not losing it as bad as you think. It's these hidden variables underneath it that are there if you really just open up and explore. So I want to encourage people, when you get in these situations, you feel like you're dominated, when you break it down, it really doesn't take a lot to close that gap. I'm going to come up with a few more videos probably later this week. It's been a while since I really dove into it, but there's been 3 months more of PvP officers, a few changes in the game, and a few things that we want to look at. So I'm probably going to do full officer review of the last 3-4 months next, so stay tuned for that. I know this one's more technical and I won't get as many views on it, but I think this is really the devil's in the details stuff that you want to explore. So hopefully it is helpful to some people, and thanks for watching.